In the 1600s, European powers began carving up the Atlantic world, driven by profit, conquest, and the growing demand for enslaved African labor. The Portuguese and Spanish were first. The Dutch soon followed, building trade empires backed by corporations and cannons. But it was England that would take the transatlantic slave trade to new extremes. Backed by the crown and armed with growing naval power, the British built forts along the West African coast, captured territories, and established one of the most brutal and far-reaching slave economies in history. England's transformation into a global power began with the Reformation. In 1534, King Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England. This severed England's ties with Catholic Spain and Portugal, pushing the kingdom toward Protestantism and a new independent identity. Under Elizabeth I, England positioned itself as the defender of Protestant Europe, directly opposing Catholic Spain. England's first involvement in the transatlantic slave trade came not through colonization, but through piracy and privateering. In the 1560s, English captains like John Hawkins sailed to West Africa, where they raided coastal villages and kidnapped Africans. They then sold them to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, illegally bypassing Spanish trade laws. This marked the beginning of England's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Though Spain tightly controlled its colonies, English merchants found ways to smuggle enslaved Africans into the Americas, working alongside French and Dutch privateers. By the early 1600s, England turned from piracy to colonization. In 1607, they founded Jamestown, their first permanent settlement in North America. The colony struggled with starvation and conflict with indigenous peoples, but one thing became clear: tobacco was the key to survival. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown, carrying 20 enslaved Africans, the first recorded instance of African slavery in English North America. At first, they were treated similarly to indentured servants, but within decades, race-based slavery became the foundation of the colonial economy. By the mid-1600s, Virginia and other colonies passed laws that made African slavery permanent and hereditary. White indentured servants could earn freedom, but enslaved Africans and their descendants were trapped for life. At the start of the 17th century, the Spanish and Portuguese empires controlled vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But Britain and France saw an opportunity to weaken Spain and Portugal by seizing their colonies and breaking their monopoly over the transatlantic slave trade. In 1655, the British captured Jamaica from Spain, transforming it into a major hub of sugar production and slavery. The French followed suit, seizing Saint-Domingue in 1697, which would become the most profitable colony in the Americas. These early conquests opened the door for Britain and France to expand their influence across the Atlantic, setting the stage for their dominance over the slave trade, global commerce, and imperial expansion. With Jamaica and other Caribbean islands under British control, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of Virginia, and the rice plantations of South Carolina became some of the most profitable in the world, all dependent on enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade became the backbone of the British economy, funneling millions of Africans into brutal labor on plantations. The creation of the Royal African Company in 1672, backed by the English crown, marked a turning point. This chartered company was granted a monopoly over British trade along the African coast, and it quickly became one of the largest slave trading organizations in the world. British investors, plantation owners, and merchants grew immensely wealthy, fueling the rise of a powerful merchant class. In 1664, the British seized Cape Coast Castle from the Swedes, turning it into their primary stronghold. Just a few years later, they built Fort James in Accra, establishing yet another outpost for the growing human trafficking network. By the late 1600s, Britain had overtaken the Dutch and Portuguese to become the dominant force in the transatlantic slave trade. Between the late 1600s and early 1800s, tens of thousands of Africans passed through these coastal prisons each year, bound for brutal lives in plantations across the Atlantic. One of the greatest scholars to expose the true scale of the transatlantic slave trade was W.E.B. Du Bois. In his groundbreaking book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, published in 1895. Du Bois revealed that Britain trafficked more enslaved Africans than Portugal did in the previous 300 years. By the time Britain abolished the trade in 1807, it had transported at least 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, more enslaved Africans in a short span than any other nation in history. The British economy was built on slavery. The wealth generated from human trafficking did not stay in the Caribbean. It was reinvested into Britain's industries, ports, and banking system. By the 1700s, slavery-funded wealth powered the Industrial Revolution. Cotton mills in Manchester thrived, using raw materials grown by enslaved Africans in the Americas. Shipbuilding in Liverpool and Bristol boomed as thousands of slave ships were constructed to transport cargo. Sugar processing plants and rum distilleries in Britain transformed Caribbean crops into highly profitable commodities. The entire British economy was tied to slavery, from the plantations in the Americas to the factories and banks in London. As Britain's slave-based economy grew, so did the power of its merchants. By the late 1600s, a new class of rich traders, bankers, and shipbuilders emerged, many of them richer than the nobility. These wealthy merchants demanded more influence over government, challenging the authority of the monarchy. The king, who once ruled by divine right, now found himself in conflict with a class of men who controlled Britain's wealth. King Charles I's taxation policies angered these new elites, leading to the English Civil War between 1642 to 1651 and his execution in 1649. After a brief republic under Oliver Cromwell, the monarchy was restored, but tensions remained. By 1688, these tensions exploded into the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament, backed by merchants and wealthy elites, forced King James II from the throne. Rather than face execution like Charles I, James II fled to France, where he spent the rest of his life in exile. The Glorious Revolution permanently weakened the monarchy and marked the rise of Parliament as the dominant force in British politics. With Parliament now in control of British trade policy, Britain began an aggressive expansion of its transatlantic slave trade and colonial empire. By the mid-18th century, Britain was no longer just an empire. It was the dominant force in global trade, powered by slavery, colonial exploitation, and a financial system built on human suffering. The vast profits from the transatlantic slave trade, which had once been controlled by the Royal African Company, now flowed into private merchants, banks, and the British Crown itself. These profits fueled the rise of Britain's industrial cities, Liverpool, Bristol, and London, transforming them into financial centers that dominated the global economy. As W.E.B. Du Bois documented, Britain transported over 3 million enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was not only the foundation of Britain's Caribbean and North American colonies, but it also directly funded the British military, navy, and banking system. The scale was staggering. By the early 18th century, British traders were moving tens of thousands of enslaved Africans per year, with the Asiento of 1713 granting Britain control over the Spanish slave trade. This deal expanded Britain's reach even further, pushing their numbers to 15,000 enslaved Africans per year to Spanish colonies alone, a number that only grew as private merchants joined the trade. With this wealth secured, Britain turned its attention to territorial conquest beyond the Atlantic, expanding into South Africa, India, and Egypt. The British sought not just to control trade, but to dominate entire economies and political systems. In 1795, Britain seized Cape Colony from the Dutch, a critical move in their effort to control the Indian Ocean trade routes. Although the Dutch briefly regained it in 1803, Britain permanently occupied the colony in 1806. With this, they secured a powerful foothold in southern Africa, which would later serve as the launch pad for deeper colonial expansion into the continent. While South Africa provided a strategic naval base, India was Britain's greatest economic prize. The British East India Company, which had begun as a trading enterprise in 1600, had by the mid-18th century transformed into a military power. ruling over vast Indian territories. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where British forces defeated Indian rulers and established control over Bengal, the wealthiest province in India. Over the next century, Britain expanded its hold, using military force, economic manipulation, and alliances with local elites to bring more of India under its rule. By 1858, following a massive rebellion against British rule, the British government abolished the East India Company and took direct control of India, making it the crown jewel of the British Empire. Britain's final great conquest in this era came in 1882, when it invaded Egypt and took control of the Suez Canal, the most crucial trade route connecting Europe to Asia. The canal was essential for maintaining Britain's dominance in global trade and military logistics. With the occupation of Egypt, Britain solidified its control over both Africa and Asia, securing its position as the world's most powerful empire. By the late 19th century, Britain had become the largest empire in history, controlling nearly 1/4 of the world's land and population. From North America to the Caribbean, from Africa to India, and from Australia to the Pacific Islands, Britain's influence stretched across the globe. However, this empire was not built on freedom or justice. It was built on enslavement, violence, and economic exploitation. For centuries, the British justified their empire as a force for civilization and progress, claiming they were bringing order to the world. But in reality, it was a system designed to extract wealth, strip nations of their independence, and consolidate power in the hands of a few. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the past. See you in the next video.